Hello everyone. I'm very delighted to be here in the Open edX Conference 2023. My name is Shillo. I'm the Learning Technology Lead of Midlink, and we are providing AWS services and top-notch DevOps services for Open edX and other open source solutions. I'm also the Chief Architect of Campus IL, the National Learning Platform of Israel, and I'm very, very happy to have here today Karl Fogel. And Karl, maybe you can introduce yourself in a few words?
Sure, in a few words. I've been involved in open source software as a programmer first, and then programmer, project leader, and kind of consultant, helping organizations sort of navigate the cultural waters of open source since 1992 or 3, so gosh, 30 years now. Yeah, that's what I do.
Great. Thank you, Karl. And I've been in your keynote speak, which was really, really interesting. One of my life missions is to reduce the social gaps and improve the social mobility in societies in Israel and around our region. And since 2004 around, I'm also very involved in open source community and the open source community. And this is why it's really interesting to hear a little bit your voice. And I do have a question, like from your experience, how does open source solutions and how does the open source supports like narrowing these gaps? And maybe you have some examples of how it happens in different countries or different cultures?
Oh, I might have perhaps a disappointing or pessimistic answer for you. So to start with, like in theory, open source should be a great place for providing opportunities for people who might not have them in other areas, because, in theory, it's a meritocracy. You show up with your code, your documentation contribution, whatever it is, you're evaluated on the basis of that by the project. And if you disagree with the power structure there, you can copy the entire project. That's what the open source license guarantees, the freedom to fork, as it's called. And so you and allies could have your own copy of the project and run it how you prefer. And of course, the existence of that threat means that the original project is likely to be amenable to participation because they don't want to see a fork happen. Nobody really wants that. So in theory, it should be a great environment for sort of being accepting of people coming from all different directions and backgrounds. In practice, that is not the case, I think, for several reasons. One is that even in a space that is sort of not formally governed, which nothing that can be forked can really be, it can't be dictatorially governed, but there are still cultural conventions that by which people will be more or less accepting. And in practice, those cultural conventions in open source are largely derived from sort of like North American and Western European culture, because that's where open source came from, and specifically from well-educated, highly literate classes of people who had access to computing technology and good network connections, good internet connections, usually from when they were young. And why is it important that they had that access when they were young? Because largely being able to participate in open source as a professional is a function of having been able to make investments at a time when one could be insensitive to opportunity cost, which is something you can't do if you don't have a lot of money in your family. Right. It's like you can stay in hacking all night on a thing and sleep in the next morning when you're a teenager or a college student, but that implies that you're in college, or you're a teenager who doesn't have to get up and go to work because your family needs the money. So actually, I find that open source participation is not fully and not fatally, but it is a filter for privilege in a lot of ways. So there's a down answer.
Yeah, and there is a down answer actually, because it's really surprising, but maybe we can take it as a challenge.
I agree, yeah. There are a lot of things that one can and I think should do in projects to alleviate that. And to some extent, I wish, I'm sorry, you might have been about to ask a question and I just started running right into an answer.
Please continue.
But okay, thank you. But there's only so much that the projects themselves can do. Like the people who are showing up to contribute are who they are. It's very hard for a project to go out and find people on its own, right? It has to wait for the pull request or the issue ticket to get filed. Organizations, however, that are supporting open source projects or using open source and contributing I don't mean supporting in a charitable sense, I just mean engaging productively and constructively with open source in whatever way, could be trying to structure things through their procurement, like what firms they engage, through internships, through how they engage their student bodies, if they're educational organizations, in ways that promote people being able to participate in open source projects who might not otherwise have thought that that was a viable avenue for them, or might just simply not have had the time. And then there might be, for the projects, there might be some cultural changes that would help that. So for example, one thing I've discovered, I was working in an open source project that started for business reasons. It took in a lot of contributors suddenly who were living in India and were raised in India. And there is not it is not the same culture of kind of direct technical criticism. Now, open source people would love to say, and many of them I think sincerely believe, oh, open source is where like, when you file a change, a merge request or a pull request, people are going to comment on the technical deficiencies in it, and that is a form of flattery, and you should interpret it that way. But it's a lot easier to not have an emotional response to it if you were not raised in a place where criticism of that direct and kind of unpadded kind is meant to be taken personally. Like here, we take those criticisms as just being a matter of like, we're all trying to make this PR better, so it's fine. It's not the case that there's no way to make a good technical criticism in Indian culture, or I should say Indian cultures, there's more than one. Yeah. But the way you would do it would be different. Like the direct technical criticism has a different shape, takes different tactics there than it does in privileged America, which is my native land, right? And so maybe projects might need to adjust the way they do their criticisms. We did, in fact, in that project a little bit, and it had an effect. It made it more welcoming to a certain kind of contributor and perhaps to other people who, while not from India, also found that more welcoming.
I think that because I think it's related also to the first fact that because the open source grows in like US or like in our privileged cultures, it's hard, or we need to rethink about how to do it in other cultures, and it's not just like a copy paste. It's something that needs to be evolved from the local culture.
It will change as it gets people from more and more backgrounds, and it's not just about privilege. It's just about cultural conventions.
I agree.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So, Karl, you wrote several books. And
well,
I'm really
two books.
Several still. And I really recommend to see your keynote speak. Keynote speak. But I do want like have a question. So let's assume that we are having like a huge open source, a huge product that we want to open source, right? And authoring to. And it actually happens. And we want
This is not a coincidental example.
And yes, but we do. But maybe you can give us like 2 or 3 best practices or recommendations in like 2
I'll try. Yeah, very quickly. So the first one you're going to hate me for, which is don't be in that position of open sourcing a thing that has already been developed. The very best thing you can do is have been open source from day one. Do the development in the open from the very first commit. In fact, from the design documents and the user research. That should all be open too. That every time that organizations try to open source an already written piece of software, they run into problems. You find there are comments checked into the code that are saying unacceptable things about a potential customer, or sometimes there are passwords checked into the code, or sensitive identifying information about that has to do in the test data. There are just all sorts of stumbling blocks. So the first thing is be open as early as possible, ideally from the very start, from day 0. Second thing is understand the concerns of the engineers who, if they don't have experience in open source, they may feel, oh yeah, but okay, look, there's some things I'm embarrassed about in that code. It's not perfect, like, can you just wait, can I just clean up that thing first? And there are things you can explain. First of all, no one cares, no one's gonna look at your code. We're gonna open this thing, we're gonna have a big press conference, there's gonna be a press release, and then the next day there'll be utter silence. No one is gonna be looking at the code. Thank you. It won't matter.
Yeah.
And to the extent that it does matter, all of those programmers who look at your code, they've also written ugly code before, and they are not going to judge you for it. They're just going to read it. They're going to learn what they can. They may ask you questions. They might make suggestions, and that's the whole reason we opened the code. Your job is not going to be less secure after this, and nor should you feel personally or professionally, insecure as a programmer as a result. Any other recommendations? You want to have full organizational buy-in. You don't want to do it, but then discover that like way upstairs, the president or the general counsel has reservations about this step. If you can open source with partners who can join you in the announcement and then join you in the actual engineering immediately afterwards, like get those commitments lined up, that makes the launch much more successful. The moment of open sourcing a product is a moment when you will get some attention, not always engineering attention, but you'll get organizational attention from potential customers or partners or other organizations who are interested in the software from a kind of higher level perspective. So you don't want that moment to go to waste. Line up everything you can so that when the announcement goes wherever it's going to go and people suddenly turn their eyes to your thing, you've got a lot of information that they might want to see ready to go.
Karl, so first of all, thank you very much for sharing all this information with us. I do want to share just like some personal note, because we have kind of a situation in Israel where the democracy, we want to keep our democracy.
I noticed.
And I just want to say that if we want to continue with all this like open source and open education and like being open, we really need to keep Israel democracy. And we are on it. We are trying.
There are open source programmers in non-democratic and in quite non-free countries. There are even open source programmers in China, and now, sad to say, Russia, but they're still doing it. But it's not the ideal environment, and not just because it's bad for open source.
Yes, so we will keep the environment. Karl, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.